Other than the election of Trump, what do you think was the most significant development that you spotted in the 24 election?
The continuing movement of ethnic minorities toward the Republicans. That we've seen movement in the past few elections, and the polls were clearly picking it up, but some people were in denial and some people thought it was exaggerated. But the way, in particular, Latino men moved toward Trump, this is a clear warning to the Democrats. I mean, the klaxons should be going on everywhere in Democratic circles. That it was one thing to lose white working class people, but the presumption was that the growing number of minorities would make up for those in the long run. And as one of your other guests, whom I agree with 99% of the time, Reed Teixeira, has pointed out that just not the way it's working out. And so if the Democrats become simply a party of affluent, upper middle class, college educated people, they're in for a long time in the wilderness.
The great irony of Teixeira's work is that his work with John Judas inspired
Yes,
the
right.
rhetoric within the Democratic Party that all we had to do was sit back and wait, and everything would be hunky dory. And he now strongly disagrees with that message.
Yes, reality has a way of coming back to bite you sometimes. There's this old phrase, demography is destiny. It's just an exaggeration. It's demography which is reacted to by political entrepreneurs and who sort of figure out ways to take advantage or fail to take advantage of the trends that they see. And what's happened is, I don't know whether through sheer dumb luck or whether kind of a feral kind of political intelligence, Donald Trump saw things that other people didn't see.
Yeah, it's his outsider status. I actually give him, it was the personal observation, I would never elevate to the level of, I don't know, real opinion. I think he's far smarter than people give him credit for. I think back to the days of Ronald Reagan when my friends were always explaining to me he's such a stupid man. He falls asleep in cabinet meetings, and I would turn to them and say, if he's so stupid, why does he beat us all the time?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, right.
I just think there's a lot, if a feral intelligence. I like that. That may be the description of Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I've often wondered what is it? It's the fact that he spent so much of his life on the outside and interacted so much with like ordinary people in the building trades, guys who and just saw a side of America that the typical Manhattan resident just doesn't see. But somehow he knows how to connect. Here's an anecdote. Back in 2016, I was visiting some of my friends at Harvard. And this was before the spring, before he had already announced, but he wasn't being taken seriously. And I went down to the square and got in a taxi, and the driver was a black guy. And as we drove away, he asked me, he said, "Do you mind if I keep listening to this? I really like this guy." And after a few blocks, I realized he's listening to Trump. And every now and then he'd laugh a little and hit the steering wheel, like right on. And by the time I got to my destination, I realized what any number of people have realized, of course, since then. But he was connecting with Trump, or Trump was connecting with him, and not at all on the level of substance. It was purely on the level of attitude. That Trump was sticking it to the man, telling him to shove it. And this guy appreciated that. He could imagine himself or how good it would feel for him to stick it to the man. Maybe a different man, but just this sort of people on the outside, people who feel marginalized. The Democrats talk about marginalized people in terms of ethnic minorities, et cetera. This was a guy who felt marginalized by, I think, the broader society, and Trump was speaking to him.
I thinking back on the Democratic campaign this time, it struck me that that continued to take place. A lot of the campaign was the whole period of joy, that joy was going to elevate us into the presidency. I really understood the joy of shedding the Biden
Yes.
problem
Yes.
That was a huge defeat we were headed into. So it was legitimate for Democrats to have a certain amount of joy, but to build a campaign around that and to think that that is outreach just sort of baffled me.
Yeah. Yeah. No, these are people who are hurting economically. And there's a sense, I'm talking to people like my barber, there's this general sense that everything is out of control,
Yeah.
that nobody's really running anything anymore. And California, I mean, we have all these photos every night about people who back a stolen car into the store and then loot the store, and just sort of tell people crime was down. They didn't see it, or the whole Paul Krugman theory of or way of looking at the world, which is, you dumb, dim-witted voters don't realize that inflation is gone and the aggregate wages have kept up with aggregate prices. And so what are you bitching about? It just sort of, there was so much of the Democratic attitude in the campaign, it just didn't connect with people.
Yeah. I really was struck by that. So let me go back to an issue you've raised over and over that the elections these days are being decided more and more by independents. Have you had a chance to look at the 24 situation and figure out if independents played a crucial role in this election as well?
No, no, I haven't yet. Now we will be able to. I don't know if we've talked about this, but here at Stanford, Doug Rivers, who's the chief scientist at UGov, has been conducting we call it the SAY 24 study for Stanford, Arizona State, Yale. It's a cooperative study, which started out interviewing more than 100,000 people. And there have been repeated surveys of this sample. So we are going to be able to look at we're going to be able to look at young Asian women, and how there's simply a big enough sample. But no, as yet, we don't have the final data yet from the post-election survey. But the reason independents are more and more important is the parties are so close. It's the Democrats have simply lost their New Deal majority. They're about the same number of Democrats and Republicans in the election or in the electorate. And so independents hold the balance of power now in a way they didn't when the Democrats had a solid majority.
The last polling, the gross polling figures I was seeing prior to the election. This is not talking about the election. Independents were the single largest group of the electorate, which just sort of boggles people's minds. When I point that out, they literally won't believe me. It could not possibly be. But that's what's going on.
Yeah, and as you know, we've talked about this before in earlier episodes. Quite a lot of my colleagues, it's the prevailing view is that most independents aren't really independents, that they lean. And I've pushed back on that notion by saying if you look at them over time, they don't necessarily lean consistently. They lean Republican in one election, they lean Democrat in another election. So in fact, they're not just hidden partisans. They're people who are using their vote decision in a given election to tell you how they answer that question, where do I lean? And so I think the proportion of independents, true independence, is not 43%, like some of the latest figures show, but it's certainly not as low as 10%, which some people claim. But even if it were only 10%, when you have the two parties dead even,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
10% determines the election.
yeah. My favorite argument against the leaner argument is the fact that that question is asked at all.
Yes,
So
yes.
you're a pollster and you go out and you interview people and you say, Wally Knox, what are you? Well, I'm a Democrat. And there's no follow up. But if Wally Knox says, I'm an independent, it's immediately followed up with, really? You're an independent?
Mhm.
Don't you
Mhm.
really lean to one or the other side? And then they get the result that the person begins saying, oh, yes, I lean to one or another side. I just think the pollsters giving cues like crazy to the folks he's interviewing, and people are answering the way the pollster wants them to.
Yeah, I think this is well known, but one of the late in his career, Warren Miller, who was one of the original four horsemen of the Michigan studies, expressed regret that he had ever wanted to ask that question, the leaner question. He said, when you ask Republican, Democrat, or Independent, you get an identification. This is what they are. Then you ask them where do they lean, he said, then you start picking up all of the campaign stuff. you start picking up how they're reacting to the current campaign. And so that answer becomes polluted by the short-term firsts of the campaign. He published this in an APSR article, but he also expressed this to me a number of times. Partly, he said, you revisionists would not have been able to make any hay if it was just stuck with the original question.
So, although we can't go out on a limb and start speculating on where exactly the independents played a role here, I don't see any indication so far that the independents did not make the decision for America as to who the president was going to be.
No, I just until I see better data, I won't take a position. The exit polls, we know there are big problems with those, and so I'll wait until we have until we have better data. But the point is, I mean, the independent category, I've emphasized this again and again, it's heterogeneous. It includes what people often think of as the centrist, the principled moderate, and so forth. But it also includes people who don't fit. What if you're a social liberal and an economic conservative, a libertarian, or the opposite? You're a populist, as many working class people are. You're a social conservative but an economic liberal. Well, you don't really fit the party structure. Well, and frankly, a lot of independents are just clueless. They're people who don't pay enough attention to politics to know what they are. But the point is, all these people are more malleable. They move more than true partisans do. And so their movements from election to election, I agree with you there, do determine the outcome.
He became famous for taking on the belief that the American public had divided into two sides. We were polarized. And I still to this day have conversations with friends who simply don't understand your position. And I thought I'd give you an opportunity to go at it once again. So, my
Yeah.
simple version of your position was that there was sorting going on
Yes.
a
Yeah.
massive scale, liberals into the Democratic Party, conservatives into the Republican Party, but that was not polarization. And my friends look at me and say, polarization, sorting, it looks the same to me.
Yes.
Walk us into why there's a difference.
All right. I'm currently working on my next and presumably last book. The previous one was An Era of Unstable Majorities. The next one is going to be An Era of Unstable Majorities Continues. And in one of the chapters, it's been published on the Hoover website. I deal with this because I get this all the time. I got it yesterday morning at breakfast with one of my former advisees who said, "Do you still believe this?" And I tried to explain. But here's the way I describe it, that why it's important. Like what I argue is, put it this way: if you look at, say, the ideological distribution of the American public, how many are liberals, how many are moderates, how many conservatives, it's the same as it was in 1976. It hasn't changed. And every long-term series that we have shows the same thing. Now, what has changed is if you divide up by Democrats and Republicans, well, Democrats used to have a lot of conservatives, Republicans used to have a lot of liberals. Now you see just the trends going in the opposite direction. So yeah, together you get no change. And people say, well, that's a distinction without a difference. You have party polarization, which I've always said we have party polarization. It's not a difference, a distinction without a difference. There was a book published a few years ago called A History of Party Polarization in America. It doesn't talk about the Civil War. Now, the Civil War is a fairly polarized period, but the authors point out it wasn't a period of party polarization because the Whigs disappeared, the Republicans emerged on the scene, the Democrats split all to hell, and so it wasn't party polarization. And you don't have to go back that far. You and I would remember this. A lot of the younger reporters and students certainly don't remember this, but we used to have a lot of polarization in the 50s and early 60s over civil rights. But it wasn't party polarization. When the Civil Rights Bill was being polarized by the Southern Democrats, Everett Dirksen brought 16 Republican senators to break the Southern Democratic filibuster. Now, can you imagine Mitch McConnell bringing 26 Republicans to bail out Joe Biden today? No, the mind boggles at that possibility. And just a few years after that, Vietnam. It's a very polarizing period, but the protesters who trashed the Democratic Convention were Democrats, and the cops who beat them up were Democrats. It wasn't party polarization. So you can have deep polarization of society without the parties being polarized. And when that happens, you do have bipartisanship. you do have bipartisan coalitions and so forth. And what's different between now and the 60s is the parties have polarized along the same lines as the issue, whereas in the 60s they cross-cut the issue. And so it makes a big difference for the politics of the country whether the parties are aligned along the line of cleavage or whether they straddle the cleavage lines. So it makes a difference. Sorting and polarization are two different things.
In I'm inviting you to speculate, and you may not bite on this, but the 2024 elections, is there something you will look for in the data that will give you an indication of whether the sorting process is continuing, or is it stabilized? I mean, it's hard to imagine that it could continue forever. You read as a statistical point where there just isn't anybody else to move into one or another of the parties. What do you think? What are you going to look for?
Well, the fact that 40% of the country says they're independent sort of strongly suggests they're not happy with the way the parties are sorted. So I've always, and my friends laugh at me. I do this quadrennial op-ed every 4 years about wanting a third party. Wanting Jim Webb, wanting Bloomberg, wanting who's the Starbucks guy. Somebody else to run, and or as David Brooks said years ago, a younger, saner Ross Perot. That was one of his better comments. Yeah.
We'll
Uh,
have to explain to folks who Ross Perot was, but
That's
that's
true.
another issue.
That's true. Yeah, but so there's a market out there, and the question is, I mean, do things have to get worse before they get better? I just don't. I mean, what if Trump totally fails? We have a recession. What if the Democrats take back the Congress without having really done anything? How long can we continue in this sort of basically pretty crappy political period, which I also want to say these are not unusual in our history. We don't teach history anymore, but there have been a lot of crappy political eras in our history. So I mean, I don't know how to end it. And there are strong forces supporting it. One is we've talked about before, the nationalization of politics. That you have these, fundraising networks, and Texas money is going to Republicans, in Ohio and in Oregon, and Hollywood and Manhattan money is going to Democrats in New Mexico and New Jersey. So, and they force the same agendas on people who represent vastly different constituencies. And it didn't used to be that way. When I started out as a political scientist, nearly all the money in a congressional race came from the people in that district. Nearly all the money in the senatorial race came from that state. And now it's just totally different. And the other thing is some political scientists point out just in your industry, the news industry, how many newspapers anymore still have bureaus in all the states? How many still have Washington bureaus? How many journalists are there out there nowadays? How many newspapers? All that there's been sort of a nationalization of news that people get less and less local news. They know less and less about local politics, state politics. They're less engaged at the local level. These are all documented trends. And so sort of the national issues and the national divisions now shape local politics to a greater extent. When a city council meets, what business of theirs? What's going on in Gaza? They should be worried about the potholes, I think, and so forth. But that's what ends up happening in the United States today.
Some of
So
the
these are
most
strong forces, and how to counteract these, I don't know.
some of the most successful Democrats bucking the election results this year included my favorite, Marie Gluesenkamp Perez
Yes.
in Washington, who ostentatiously says that she's not concerned with the national party and works hard to convince voters that just isn't something she cares about. She cares about, and then goes into a litany of detailed discussion of what's happening in the third grade, in the schools, et cetera, et cetera. And not only won this time, but expanded her support significantly.
Mhm.
So it certainly tracks what you're saying. There's an element of the population which seems tired of the nationalization of things.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just put in a plug for a colleague, a young colleague, Yana Krupnikov. She and her husband, John Barry Bryan. I don't know if you've had them on, really, maybe, but oh,
I
you did.
had Yana
Okay.
on.
Oh,
Yes,
good.
right.
Good. But the whole idea that there is this 15% maybe of people who live and breathe politics and who participate and who shape politics. And they are different from the other 85% of us. And they're responsible for a lot of the pathologies in our politics today.
So let me shift to a different topic, and again, we're treading dangerously close to what happened in 2024. And I read your resistance to go there because you have a lot of work to do on looking at the results. But prior to the election, you commented that neither party was positioned to become a long-term majority party, and it's another way of saying we are stuck in a crappy politics in which there's no stability to governance. One party wins an election for a brief period of time, and I'm sound like I'm quoting you on unstable majorities, which I shamelessly am. One party wins an election, declares that the electorate has shifted massively in its favor.
Yes.
Joe Biden decides he's FDR reborn, passes a whole bunch of stuff that the advocates care about deeply, and the public doesn't give a damn at
Yeah.
best. And then the rival comes in, which sounds pretty much like 2020 and
Mhm.
2024.
Yeah.
But was there something else about the lack of position for long? What would you look to as a strong indication that a one or another party was establishing a foothold that could be a long-term stability in the government, other than waiting 20 years to find out
Mm.
who actually pulls it off?
Well, there aren't many cases, but historically, these kinds of eras have ended with a massive victory by one party. McKinley just cleans out, what's his name? Uh,
No,
I,
Davis, maybe. Is that the
at
name?
my age, I'm just terrible with names. But the Cross of Gold guy,
Oh, Brian,
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 William
Brian.
Jennings Bryan,
Yeah.
exactly. And then FDR comes into the Depression. And then you could talk about a mandate. And typically the mandate is, for God's sake, do something different. You know, the mandate isn't well shaped. But to claim you have a mandate after a narrow victory, as Bush did in 2004, as even Obama did, as certainly as the Republicans do this time, that's just a pipe dream. What they're doing now is simply trying to win enough votes at the margin to win power. And it's become a purely tactical game. And you back an issue if you think it'll hurt the other party or help you, not because you think it's actually going to meet a problem. Now, when you win big, if you win 60-40, at that point you think, I really have responsibility to do something. And if you do it successfully, then it's not necessarily a long-term majority, but pretty long-term in American politics. And so that might augur, unfortunately, for the idea that things have to get worse before they get better, that we have to have a real rip-roaring depression or a major war that really kills a lot of people or something. I don't want those, but historically, it seems like that's the way these eras end.
Yeah, a major non-political event takes place
Mhm.
that the politics is overwhelmed by.
Mhm.
Um, I have watching the results of 2024 and hearing people speculate on it. To me, the single most telling indication that Trump's power as president has real limits was his absolute failure to dictate to the Senate who the Senate leader should be, to dictate to the
Yeah.
Republicans,
Yes.
sorry, let me correct that,
Mhm.
in the Senate who they should select for their leader in the Senate. They had 53 Republican votes. And I hope I get this number correct. Trump's selection, Rick Scott of Florida, got 13 of the 53 and was eliminated in the first round. And then they moved on to the second round, where the real contestants
Mhm.
had a contest, and one of them won. But Trump's was astonishing. He could muster 13 of 53 Republican senators. Now, a senator is very different than a member of the House of Representatives. These are folks with 6 years under their belt, and that may play a role in the lack of Trump's ability to dictate to them. But
Yeah,
I,
yeah, you and I both have people in our circles who were depressed and just sure they believed we had elected an emperor or a dictator. And I try to explain to people it doesn't work that way in the United States, that the government is such a ponderous enterprise, and he can't even control his own party. And just the incident you point out is great. The fact that as soon as Gates was announced, it became very doubtful he was going to be confirmed. I mean, this is just days after the election, let alone, a few months from now when the various lobbying groups and the groups in the states are going to approach their members of Congress and say, you really don't want to do that. It's going to hurt us here. That the people who are afraid of massive change and millions of people going to be deported, et cetera, that's just not the way the United States works.
So I gather you're not obsessed with the oncoming wave of fascism. I mean, how do you deal with those kinds of
I,
claims?
I point out Google George Bush fascist, and and in fact,
Sorry.
thousands of hits there that they were calling George Bush a fascist. They've been calling fascist Republicans. That's just what you say, Republican fascist. That goes back to Barry Goldwater. You find, and so every campaign they label the Republican candidate a fascist. And the socialists has lost its sting, but of course, Democrats were labeled socialists. But kids nowadays don't think, well, what's so bad about being a socialist? They
I
don't
know,
know.
I know.
Yeah, right.
It used to, back when I was a Democratic Socialist, it was a big deal.
Yeah, right.
I came back from Vietnam as a rather hot under the collar, angry young man, and promptly became a Democratic Socialist for a while.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, there's a lot of discussion about. We're going to shift the conversation now, if you don't mind. There's a lot of discussion now about solving our problems through reform of how the elections are conducted. And a moment ago, we were talking about Marie Gluesenkamp Perez. She and Jared Golden, a Democratic member of Congress from Maine, have introduced a platform. It's a substanceless invitation to the parties to form a committee to seriously discuss changing the way the elections are conducted. And I think they list a half a dozen concepts to be thrown into the hopper and kicked around. Is that an area that you've thought about at all?
No, I mean, Ben Ginsburg spent some time at Hoover, and I had conversations with him. But no, it's a bit outside my areas of expertise. I mean, I do worry, and also Justin Grimmer and Andy Hall, two of my younger colleagues, have done extensive research on election fraud and so forth, basically including there's nothing there. Um, I mean, it strikes me there is a lot to be done that could be done. Unfortunately, our federal system makes it difficult, but there's a lot could be done about cleaning up the electoral process. I mean, we're still counting votes in California.
Yeah,
It's just sort of like we have races
yeah.
that aren't decided yet. And we have a Zoom group with international scholars, and they're basically aghast at the lack of election security here. That, what do you mean you don't have identification? Of course you need to have identification. And as my colleagues put it doesn't matter, but nevertheless, it gives the impression that fraud is possible. And ordinary people out there sort of the process is just so messy that it makes people doubt it. Look, California is supposed to be a pretty clean state, but my younger son graduated from college and totally left California. He went to school in Maine, but he hasn't been around here for 12 years. He continues to get a ballot. My wife and I
Yeah.
could vote him. They don't clean the rolls. They don't strike anybody from the rolls. And so there may be people who are voting extra ballots. My colleagues say it doesn't really happen, but it could. For the ordinary person looking, it could. Or the signature verification. My God, the 2020 election. I remember I was 3 months away from carpal tunnel surgery, and I could barely just hold a pen, let alone. And I scribbled this thing on. And I said to my wife, "They'll never match this signature." They did, So because they weren't doing anything, they were just taking them all. So it's just our process is so ugly that I think it leaves room for normal people to doubt the integrity of the process. So I really would like to see things cleaned up. I'd like to see an ID card at a minimum. Not that it's, the Democrats say, well, there's no fraud actually taking place. Well, then there's no problem with having an ID card. I mean, it's just a gesture. And so I think procedures would help, but they don't get at the fundamental problem we have now, which is sort of just the parties, the way the parties are constructed.
I find myself becoming a dedicated old fogey when people propose changes in election structure, multi-member congressional
Oh,
districts,
mm,
ideas like that, and
yeah.
ranked choice
Yeah.
voting. All of these
Mm,
seem to be interesting ideas with a kernel of truth, but I sniff at them and I say, is this the problem in our politics?
mm,
Is this does this go to the heart of what's going on?
yeah.
And for
Mm,
here we are talking about, is there a potential for one or another party to stably govern the country for a number of elections and a number of years, to articulate a policy and have time to implement the policy over years? I don't see those reforms addressing that.
yeah, absolutely. And when people say, okay, ranked choice voting, that's the solution. Say, well, we've had 200 years of history without ranked choice voting, and sometimes it worked pretty well. So what's ranked choice voting going to do that other things haven't done? There's deeper things at work here than sort of some way of counting votes or some way of casting votes.
Here in California, we've tested one of the theories, which is that if you eliminate partisan primaries, and you have a cattle call primary where everyone runs against everyone, that will clean up the system and give us all kinds of benefits. I haven't noticed,
No,
I hate to be so critical, but I haven't noticed California leaping into the lead on electoral success in particular, because we have
yeah.
this wonderful change to our system. It's a different system, and arguably it's cleaner and more direct in some ways, but it hasn't transformed a darn thing.
No, no. There was a line of political science research a couple decades ago where they just couldn't find any difference between the candidates who were elected from partisan primaries and nonpartisan primaries. Then I think a young scholar, Seth Hill, found the difference was just any primary. And the reason was it's only the partisans who show up, even in a nonpartisan primary. The nonpartisan and the independents just don't bother to go. They can't be bothered. So it's the primary system, which on the other hand is better than the convention system. I remember the Utah Senator Bennett, who was who was incumbent, thrown out by the convention system in Utah. So it's the basic problem is most people really don't want to be involved in politics. That's just the way it is. And so any hurdles that are thrown up to participation is enough to weed out most people except the most extreme partisans or the activists.
Well, let me throw that right straight back at you, because I found myself thinking about the primary problem the other day and not just flat out unable to come up with any way to really grapple with it. It is the primary system was sold to us for good reason as more democracy. What could be wrong with more democracy? And I agree with that. And I embraced it as a young man and accepted that there would be no faults to it whatsoever. But the more I'm around, I find myself thinking the same thing you alluded to a moment ago, which is that system, because it weeds out the relatively uninterested, the relatively unconcerned voter, it weeds all those folks out. Who's left? It's the Wally Knoxes of the Democratic Party who are obsessed with politics day and night. I don't want I don't want a Democratic Party that's full of people exactly like me, because we'll never get anybody elected. And if they're elected, they'll never do a darn thing. It's just what I would really love to see is one in which, uh, well, I don't know. Could you go to something like a crazed European system where folks were forced to vote? Now, does that solve your problem, or does that just reek to high heaven?
Well, that sort of solves the problem maybe improves things for the general election, but still the way the candidates are chosen over there is in typically closed kind of systems where the party bosses, and remember, historically, the primary movement, the party bosses in those days were considered to be non-ideological, just corrupt, sort of like, and so this was designed to bring more politics, more program. Whereas now, if you left everything up to the party bosses, I would hate to think what the California Democratic Party would and the California Republican Party, the candidates they would foist on the rest of us. Yeah.
So here, the one of the standard questions folks always ask about campaigns, presidential campaigns in particular, is do the campaigns of the candidates make much difference, or are the campaigns so much a referendum on the success or failure of the party that's been in office for 4 years previously that the campaigns are on the periphery, shall we say, of influence? What's your? I know once again you would like to look at the stats and voice an opinion once you've had an opportunity to review the data, but so far, where do you think this election fell? Was it about the failures of the Biden administration, or was it because of the brilliant campaigns run or not run?
Yeah, I've been gathering up all kinds of articles. I love the postmortems after elections. And on the winning side, the postmortem is always really simple. Well, the voters are rational, informed. They looked at our candidate and our platform, and we were clearly the best. So on the losing side is where you get all the action. And the losing postmortems fall into three categories. The first one, which is by the most committed partisan people, is if the problem is the voters. We need new voters. You know?
Well, that's a reform.
Yeah.
That's a reform measure.
And I mean, it could be either like Paul Krugman, oh, it's just the voters are too dim-witted to appreciate all that we've done for them and everything. Or it could be toxic. They're misogynistic, they're sexist, they're racist. We need to move to a country that has better people. Okay. And then there's the one we're seeing now by Seth Moulton and other people is we need to look at the mirror. The electorate is not buying what we're selling. And in between, you have the one you mentioned, which is, well, it's partly our fault because we didn't choose the right candidate or we didn't run a good campaign. We just didn't, our messaging wasn't good. We just didn't get across what we'd done and what we were going to do.
We needed a
And
nifty slogan.
yeah, right. Politics of joy. Oh, it just didn't work. And uh, I think there's a little bit to that on the margins. But the big problem with figuring out the effect of the campaign is the campaign is endogenous. And I have another one of these social science terms. But you remember Mike Dukakis in the spring in 1988, for you young people out there, this is before your time, but Waller remembers this. He's ahead by 17 points of George H.W. Bush. And everybody's saying this is just what the electorate wanted, a sort of hard-headed technocrat, non-ideological candidate after the wars of the Reagan administration. And
Heavy into transportation and railroads.
Yes,
and
exactly. Then he loses
endless
the election.
discussion of passenger lines.
Right.
That's right.
So he loses the election. And then everybody says, he was a bloodless technocrat, didn't connect with anybody. And so the perception of what he was, the candidate was, is endogenous to what happens in the outcome, the campaign. So it's really hard to figure. But I tend to think that the campaign, look, Kamala Harris had a weak hand to play. I mean, you have the worst inflation in 50 years. You got a war, you got social disorder. You got that. It didn't matter if somebody had shown you a generic Democrat and generic Republican 10 years ago, said who's going to win under these conditions, everybody said, "Oh, the Democrats toast." So I'm just not convinced that I can tell you a story on either side of Kamala's campaign being good or bad. And I think that's the whole problem with determining whether campaigns matter. There are a whole lot of people who make a lot of money off campaigns. And so they have every incentive to say, oh, man, we can move votes right and left with our ad and this and that. But I tend to think, well, I mean, the last election, Harris vastly outspent Trump. Hillary outspent him 2-1 in 2016. That there's a certain, is the 500th ad in Ohio going to make a difference than the 499th ad? I mean, it's just sort of, it's saturation. And I'm just not convinced that campaigns make that much difference. The fundamentals shape what campaign you can run.
A good campaign pays very close attention to the I would urge pays very close attention to the fundamentals and runs with those and doesn't try to convince the public with something there just isn't in their brain cells at that time.
Yeah. Mhm.
I remember years ago with um, party activists saying, well, they want to run and we may lose this election, but we will run an educational campaign. And I always responded, yeah, you're going to educate voters that your issue sucks.
Yeah.
But they didn't appreciate that.
No, no.
Too curmudgeonly.
Yeah.
So tell me again, what is the next book?
Well, I wrote Unstable Majorities after 2016, and I intended to write another book in 2020 called The Trump Era, or the Trump elections, something like that. Because at the dawn of 2020, it looked to me like Trump was going to coast to re-election. The economy was doing just fine.
It
Minorities
sure looked that
were
way. Yeah.
yeah, there's peace on earth. Everything looked good. And then the pandemic hit. And I thought, okay, that's it. He lost. I thought that's the end of the Trump era. And then about, I don't know, 2, 3 years ago, I realized, no, 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 he's coming back, that he's not the end at all. And so I began to think, okay, I'm going to bring the book up to date. And I've done 4 essays. I can send you some things, just updating the data. And then after the election, doing an analysis of just what happened. So it'll be sort of like just another version. As I said, working title is An Era of Unstable Majorities Continues. Now, I don't see anything here, as we've talked about. It's ending this era. And at the moment, I'm not going to change anything I said earlier, just bring it up to date.
Well, to those who are listening, currently in print and available is Unstable Majorities, which is the predecessor to the workbook you're working on. I highly recommend that. It's a terrific distillation of your thinking over the course of half a dozen books that preceded it, and it's a terrific read and absolutely essential for understanding what's going on in our politics. If anyone can understand what's going on in our politics these days.
Well, thank you for the plug. I'll send you a free copy. I'll make sure. Yeah.
Please do. A carton would be great. Well, thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure.